Frank Webb sat hunched over his datapad in the cramped living room of his Titan Colony apartment, scrolling through page after page of auction listings. The blue glow from the screen was the only light in the room. It was 3 in the morning, but sleep wasn't coming easy these days. 67 years old, officially retired for 3 months now, and he was going absolutely crazy with boredom. He'd spent 45 years as a mechanic. Started young, working on mining equipment in the asteroid belts. Moved up to spacecraft repairs, then orbital platform maintenance. His hands knew the feel of a wrench better than anything else. Retirement was supposed to be relaxing, they said. Take it easy, they said. Enjoy your golden years. Frank hated every second of it. He scrolled past another listing for salvage rights to a destroyed freighter. Nothing interesting. Then his thumb stopped. He scrolled back up and stared at the screen. Ctharn Orbital Station K4477. Abandoned for 4,127 years. Location: Sector 19 Neutral Zone. Condition: non-functional. Starting bid: 8,000 credits. Frank actually laughed out loud. 8,000 credits? That was less than what a decent used cargo shuttle cost. You couldn't buy a new air filtration unit for that price. He clicked on the listing and pulled up the detailed specifications, his experienced eyes scanning through the technical readouts with practiced ease. The auction house had stamped it with every warning label they could think of. Irreparable damage. Technologically obsolete. Not compatible with modern systems. The notes section mentioned that 3 different species had sent engineering teams to survey the station over the past 100 years. All 3 teams had reached the same conclusion: scrap it for raw materials. The station was worthless. But as Frank studied the power grid layouts and structural diagrams, he saw something different. The Ctharn had built their stations to withstand anything. Sure, the systems were dead. The power cores were shot. The life support had failed thousands of years ago. But the frame itself? The basic structure? That was solid. That was good engineering that had lasted for millennia. Frank zoomed in on the corroded conduits and ancient generators. Where everyone else saw garbage, he saw potential. He saw a challenge. And after 3 months of sitting in his apartment watching entertainment feeds and trying to pretend he enjoyed doing nothing, he desperately needed a challenge. His fingers moved before his brain caught up. He placed a bid. 8,000 credits. An hour later, his datapad chimed. Video call from Rachel, his daughter. Frank glanced at the time. It was early morning on Earth. She must have been getting ready for work when she saw the transaction alert on his account. They'd set up that monitoring system after his retirement, just to make sure he didn't spend all his savings on something stupid. Dad, Rachel said the moment her face appeared on screen. Her expression was a mix of concern and exasperation. Tell me you didn't just bid on that space station. Okay, Frank said. I didn't just bid on that space station. Dad. You told me to tell you I didn't. Rachel closed her eyes and took a deep breath. You're not seriously considering buying that thing. 3 different species called it irreparable. It's been floating dead in space for 4,000 years. It's junk, Dad. Frank pulled up the structural diagrams and turned his datapad to show her. Look at this frame. Look at these support beams. The Ctharn built things to last forever. Yeah, the systems are shot. But the bones are good, Rachel. Really good. Dad, you're retired, Rachel said, her voice softening. You're supposed to be taking it easy. Relaxing. Maybe traveling. Not buying a derelict space station in the middle of nowhere. Frank set down the datapad and looked at his hands. Calloused, scarred, steady. These hands had fixed thousands of problems over the decades. They kept ships flying, kept stations running, kept people alive in the cold vacuum of space. Now they spent their days doing nothing. I've been taking it easy for 3 months, Frank said quietly. I'm dying here, Rachel. I wake up every morning with nothing to do. I go to sleep every night feeling useless. Let me do this. Let me fix something again. Rachel was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed. You're going to do this whether I approve or not, aren't you? Probably. You're impossible. I know. The auction ended 6 hours later. 12,400 credits. Frank was the only person who'd placed a bid. The station was his. 2 weeks after that, Frank stood in the airlock of a transport ship, his worn tool bag slung over his shoulder, staring out the viewport at his purchase. The Ctharn station hung in the darkness of space like some enormous dead creature. The hull was pitted and scarred from thousands of years of micrometeorite impacts. No lights glowed in any windows. No heat signature registered on the sensors. It was completely, utterly dead. You absolutely sure about this? Asked Carol, the transport captain. She was a woman in her 40s who'd been flying cargo routes for 20 years. She'd seen plenty of crazy ideas in her time, but this one seemed to top the list. I can turn this ship around right now. Take you back to Titan. Hell, I'll do it for free if you just admit this whole thing was a mistake. Frank adjusted the straps on his tool bag and checked his spacesuit seals one more time. Nah, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. I've seen worse than this. That was a lie, actually. He'd never seen anything this bad. But he wasn't about to admit that now. Not when he'd already come this far. Not when his hands were finally going to do real work again. The airlock door opened, and Frank stepped into the silence of the dead station. Frank lived in his spacesuit for the first 2 weeks straight. No gravity meant he floated through the corridors, pulling himself along with handholds. No heat meant his suit's heating elements ran constantly, draining power packs that he had to swap out every 8 hours. No atmosphere meant every breath came from his suit's recycler, and he could never take off his helmet, never scratch his nose, never really relax. Just him, his tools, and 4,000 years of corrosion eating away at everything around him. The Ktharn had built this station for methane breathers. Their biology was completely different from humans. They lived in freezing temperatures that would kill a human in minutes. They breathed gases that were toxic to anything from Earth. Every single system on this station had been designed for creatures that had nothing in common with Frank's physiology. Any sane engineer would have looked at this mess and gutted the whole thing. Rip out every alien system, install modern human equipment, start fresh. That's what those 3 survey teams had recommended. That's what made sense. But Frank wasn't gutting anything. That wasn't how you fixed something. You worked with what you had. You understood what the original builders were trying to do, and you respected that. The Ktharn engineers who built this place 4,000 years ago knew what they were doing. Their civilization had been exploring space when humans were still figuring out agriculture. Frank started with the power grid because nothing else mattered without power. He spent 3 days just mapping out the system, floating through dark corridors with a flashlight, tracing conduits with his gloved hands, making notes on his datapad. The main quantum cores were completely dead. The fancy alien technology that had once powered this entire station had degraded over the millennia into useless crystalline slag. No amount of cleaning or repairing would bring those back. But the backup systems were a different story. The Ktharn had installed what they considered primitive fusion batteries for emergency power. To them, these were outdated technology, the kind of thing you only used when everything else failed. But Frank had worked with fusion batteries his whole career. He knew them inside and out. These batteries weren't dead. They were just really corroded. Frank spent the next week cleaning contacts with wire brushes and chemical solvents. He replaced burnt-out wiring with simple copper cable from his supply kit. The sophisticated safety systems were fried beyond repair, so he bypassed them entirely, installing basic mechanical switches that he could flip by hand. No computers, no automation, just simple circuits that either completed or didn't. It was the kind of work that would have made a modern engineer cringe. But it was honest work. Reliable work. On day 16, Frank floated in front of the main power junction in Section C. He'd connected everything he could. Triple-checked every connection. It should work. Theoretically. He reached out with his gloved hand and threw the lever. For a few seconds nothing happened. Frank held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Then lights flickered to life. Dim, yellow emergency lights that cast long shadows down the corridor. They were old lights, using technology that probably hadn't functioned since humans were still living in caves on Earth. But they worked. They actually worked. Ha. Frank's voice echoed inside his helmet. Told you, you stubborn piece of junk. I told you you'd work. He was laughing, actually laughing with joy, when the proximity alert beeped in his helmet. A ship was approaching the station. Frank pulled up the communication channel. This is Web Station. Who's approaching? Web Station. A man's voice came through, sounding amused. That what we're calling this wreck now? This is the cargo hauler Betty's Run. Captain Jerry Walsh. I saw lights come on and had to check if my sensors were malfunctioning. Someone actually bought this thing? Yep, Frank said, still grinning. That would be me. You got power running on this ancient bucket? Just emergency lights so far. Working on the rest. There was a pause on the other end. You got any coffee on board? Real coffee, not the synthetic stuff. Frank did have coffee. He'd brought 3 months' supply with him. 20 minutes later, Captain Jerry was floating in Frank's tiny pressurized habitat pod, the only place on the entire station where you could take off your helmet and breathe. The pod was barely big enough for 2 people, crammed with equipment and supplies, but Jerry didn't seem to mind. They shared coffee and a meal of reheated stew while Jerry told stories about the outer colony routes. He was hauling medical supplies to a mining settlement 3 systems away. He'd been making this run for 5 years and had passed this dead station dozens of times. Never thought he'd see anyone actually trying to bring it back to life. "You're out of your mind," Jerry said when he was leaving 6 hours later, but he was grinning. "But I kinda wanna see if you actually pull this off. I'll stop by next time I'm through this sector." "Bring more coffee," Frank called after him. 3 weeks after getting the lights working, Frank tackled the gravity generators. These were massive machines built into the station's core, designed to create artificial gravity throughout the entire structure. They hadn't functioned in thousands of years. The control computers were completely dead. But the generators themselves? The actual physical machines? Those were still intact. Frank didn't try to upgrade them or replace them. He cleaned them, carefully removing centuries of built-up contamination. He realigned the internal components using nothing but a level and a lot of patience. And when the computer controls refused to cooperate, he bypassed them entirely, installing a manual lever system that wouldn't have been out of place on a 20th century Earth submarine. On day 37 he threw another lever. The generators hummed to life. Frank felt his boots settle onto the deck plating as gravity returned to Section C, real gravity. Not the spinning habitat kind, but actual artificial gravity. He stood there for a full minute, just feeling the weight of his own body, grinning like an idiot inside his helmet. Word spread fast. More ships started stopping by. Curious captains wanting to see the crazy human who was fixing the unfixable station. Some brought supplies to trade. Others just wanted to shake his hand and see the lights for themselves. A journalist from the Galactic News Network showed up in week 8. Her name was Patricia, and she couldn't understand how Frank was achieving what 3 advanced species had declared impossible. "How are you doing this?" she asked, her camera drone recording everything. The survey team said this station was beyond repair. Frank shrugged, tightening a bolt on a power conduit. "I just listen to what the machine needs. Most people try to force things to be something they're not. But if you work with what you've got, respect the original design, things usually cooperate." Patricia didn't really understand. But when she posted the interview, it went viral across a dozen systems. The crazy human fixing the dead station with duct tape and copper wire. People loved it. And Frank? He just kept working. 6 months into the project, Frank had achieved what everyone said was impossible. 3 full sections of the station now had working life support. You could walk through those areas without a spacesuit. The gravity was steady. The air was breathable even if it smelled a bit stale. The plumbing worked, which meant real showers instead of the sponge baths he'd been taking in his habitat pod. The place still looked like a junkyard inside. Exposed wiring ran along the walls. Pipes were held together with metal straps and sealant. Handwritten labels pointed to different systems because the computer displays were still dead. But it was a working junkyard. Every system Frank had touched came back to life and stayed running. That's when he found Section G. He'd been mapping out the station's layout, planning which sections to restore next, when he noticed something odd on the structural diagrams. Section G was listed, but he'd never seen an entrance to it. After 2 days of searching he found the doors. They'd been welded shut from the inside. Not just locked or sealed, completely welded like someone had wanted to make absolutely sure nobody got in there. Frank spent an afternoon cutting through the welds with his plasma torch, showering sparks all over the corridor. When the doors finally gave way with a metallic groan, he pushed them open and stepped inside. His flashlight beam swept across what looked like a massive manufacturing bay. The space was huge, easily the size of a football field, with high ceilings and equipment scattered throughout. Everything was covered in dust so thick it looked like gray snow. But underneath that dust, the equipment looked intact. Not corroded. Not broken. Just old and unused. Frank walked slowly through the bay, his footsteps leaving prints in the dust. He'd never seen anything quite like this. The machines were clearly Ktharn design, but different from anything in the other sections. More mechanical. More purposeful. He spent an entire week just trying to figure out what he was looking at. The Ktharn hadn't left any instruction manuals lying around. Every panel was labeled in their language, which looked like someone had thrown geometric shapes at a wall. Frank took photos, ran them through translation software, and slowly pieced together what this place had been built to do. It was a fabrication system. An automated manufacturing bay. You fed it raw materials from asteroids, metal or minerals, basic elements, and it would manufacture finished products. Tools, parts, components. Whatever you programmed it to make. But here was the interesting part, It wasn't like the molecular replicators that modern species used. Those worked at the atomic level, rearranging matter into whatever you wanted. They were incredibly advanced and incredibly expensive. This Ctharn system was simpler. It used actual mechanical processes. Cutting, shaping, welding, assembly. It was more like an automated factory than a replicator. Frank stared at the machines for a long time, his mind racing. The Ctharn had abandoned this station because they'd invented replicators. To them, this fabrication system was obsolete. Old technology. Not worth keeping. But Frank saw something different. He saw machines he could actually fix when they broke. He saw a system that didn't require rare exotic materials or massive power supplies. He saw technology that worked. It took him 3 weeks to get the system running. He cleaned the machines, replaced worn-out parts with components he fabricated by hand, and rewired the control systems with his usual combination of copper wire and mechanical switches. The programming was the hardest part. He had to figure out the Ctharn operating system and create new instructions using their bizarre geometric language. On the day he finished, Frank loaded raw metal into the input hopper, checked his programming one last time, and activated the system. The machines hummed to life. Conveyors started moving. Cutting lasers flickered on. For 10 minutes, Frank watched as the fabrication bay did its work, processing raw material through a dozen different stations. Then, with a soft chime, a finished product dropped into the output tray. Frank picked it up. It was a simple wrench. Basic tool. Still warm from the manufacturing process. He stood there holding that wrench and suddenly he started laughing. The laugh turned into tears. Tears of joy, relief, exhaustion, triumph. All the emotions from 6 months of impossible work came pouring out. "You okay there, Frank?" He turned to find Helen standing in the doorway. She was a freighter captain who docked an hour earlier, asking if Frank could patch some hull damage. She'd come looking for him and found him in the fabrication bay, tears streaming down his face, holding a wrench like it was made of gold. "I'm perfect," Frank said, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "Helen, look at this. This changes everything. This station isn't just a wreck I'm fixing. It's a gold mine." Helen looked confused, so Frank explained. Within a month, he had the system running at full capacity. He started selling spare parts to passing freighters. Not fancy high-tech parts. Simple, durable components that worked with older ship models. The kind of basic equipment that big manufacturers didn't bother making anymore because it wasn't advanced enough. They wanted everyone buying expensive modern systems. But there were thousands of old ships out there still running. Cargo haulers, mining vessels, colony transports. Ships that had been built 50 or 100 years ago and just kept going. Their crews needed parts and Frank could provide them. Cheaper than modern equivalents and with one huge advantage. When something broke, you could actually fix it instead of replacing the entire system. His customers loved it. Word spread fast through the shipping lanes. Captains started making detours to stop at Frank's station. Some came for parts. Others came just to see what else the crazy human had gotten working. 2 months after he'd opened for business, 3 Ctharn showed up in a research vessel. They were academics from the Ctharn Historical Society, and they couldn't believe what they were seeing. One of them, an older researcher Frank started calling Professor, kept walking around the fabrication bay touching machines with reverence. "This station was abandoned as obsolete," the professor said, his translator rendering his clicking speech into English. "My ancestors moved beyond this technology the moment they invented replicators. This system was considered primitive. Outdated." Frank shrugged, watching the machines produce another batch of valve assemblies. "Yeah, well, not everyone has replicators. For the rest of us, this is perfect." The professor studied Frank for a long moment. Then he made an offer, 1.2 million credits for the station. They wanted to turn it into a museum, preserving this piece of Ctharn history. Frank didn't even have to think about it. "No," he said simply. "But Mr. Webb." "No," Frank repeated. "This station isn't history. It's a working business. People need what I'm making here." The professor looked disappointed but nodded slowly. "I understand. May we at least document what you've accomplished? For our records." Frank agreed to that. The Ctharn researchers spent 3 days photographing everything, interviewing Frank about his methods, and marveling at how he'd brought their ancient technology back to life. Year 2 arrived faster than Frank expected. Webb's Reach, that's what people had started calling the station, and the name stuck, now had 40 permanent residents. It wasn't something Frank had planned. It just happened organically, one person at a time. Betty was the first. She was a human woman in her 30s who'd been running a food cart on a crowded station 3 sectors over. She showed up one day asking if Frank had any space to rent. Within a week, she'd opened a small restaurant in Section D. Nothing fancy, just good home-cooked meals for the crews passing through. Her chicken soup became legendary among the shipping captains. Then came the Martinez family from Talaxia 4. Father, mother, and 2 teenage kids. They were skilled mechanics who'd been bounced around from station to station, always getting pushed out by bigger operations. Frank gave them space in Section E to open a proper repair dock. They could handle the ship repairs that Frank didn't have time for anymore. A trader named Vincent showed up next, asking to rent warehouse space. He specialized in hard-to-find parts for older equipment. Within months he was doing steady business and other merchants started showing up wanting space too. The station wasn't pretty. Frank had never bothered to make it look nice. Exposed wiring still ran along the corridors, bundled together with zip ties. Hand-painted signs pointed to different sections because the fancy digital displays were too much trouble to fix. Everything was a mismatched combination of ancient Ktharn technology and human improvisation. Patches on top of patches. Jury-rigged solutions held together with determination and duct tape. But it worked. And more importantly, it worked reliably. When something broke, Frank or the Martinez family fixed it within hours. The power never failed. The life support never hiccuped. The gravity stayed steady. People trusted Webb's reach because they knew humans had built their reputation on making things work no matter what. That's when Zendax Holdings showed up. Frank was in the fabrication bay when they arrived. 3 people in expensive suits, led by a woman who introduced herself as Christine Venn, Executive Vice President of Resource Acquisition. Everything about her screamed corporate power. Perfect hair, perfect smile, and a handshake that felt like gripping ice. She made him an offer. 2 million credits for the station. Generous terms. They'd even let him stay on as a consultant if he wanted. Frank said no. The perfect smile didn't waver. Mr. Webb, perhaps you don't understand. This sector falls within Zendax Holdings' mineral extraction rights. Technically, you're squatting on corporate territory. Frank had been expecting this. 3 months earlier, while repairing the sensor array, he discovered something interesting. The asteroids in this sector were rich in rare earth elements. The kind of stuff that was worth serious money. He'd done his research, filed all the proper territorial claims with the Galactic Commerce Authority, paid the fees, and established Webb's reach as an independent sovereign territory. He pulled out his datapad and handed it to her. Already checked. Stations registered as independent territory. All the paperwork's filed. You want access to these minerals, you'll need to negotiate with me. Christine Venn's smile disappeared. She looked at the documentation for a long minute, then handed the datapad back. Her voice was cold. We'll see about that. 2 weeks later, the accidents started. Section C experienced random power fluctuations that nearly crashed the life support. Frank traced the problem to a control node that had been tampered with. The water supply in Section D tested positive for contamination. Someone had dumped industrial solvent into the storage tanks. Then a fire broke out in Vincent's warehouse. Small fire, quickly contained but suspicious as hell. Nothing was provable. No evidence, no witnesses. But Frank had worked around corporations his whole life. He knew sabotage when he saw it. The community knew it too. Jerry, the freighter captain who'd been Frank's very first visitor, organized a patrol schedule. Volunteers took shifts watching the docking bays and critical systems. Betty's restaurant became an impromptu command center where people gathered to share information and plan responses. Even Professor, the Ktharn researcher, delayed his return home to help. He documented every incident, building a legal case against Zendax. 4 weeks after the accident started, Zendax tried a more direct approach. 6 hired enforcers showed up at the station, demanding to speak with Frank. They were the kind of people corporations used when they wanted to intimidate someone. Big, armed, and not particularly subtle. They found Frank in the main corridor, surrounded by 40 very angry residents. Jerry and his crew stood to one side, hands resting on their sidearms. The Martinez family had brought their welding equipment, which could double as weapons in a pinch. Betty was holding a very large kitchen knife. Even the merchants had shown up, armed with whatever they could grab. The enforcers took one look at the situation and backed off. Whatever Zendax was paying them, it wasn't enough for this. Christine Venn tried the legal route next. She filed complaints with every regulatory body she could find, claiming everything from safety violations to territorial disputes. Frank countered every single one. His paperwork was perfect. He'd spent 6 months making sure every single claim, every license, every permit was filed correctly. He'd learned long ago that the best defense against corporations was their own bureaucracy. The legal battle dragged on for months. Zendax had expensive lawyers and unlimited resources. But they also had a public relations problem. The story had gotten out. Major corporation bullying a retired mechanic and a small community just trying to make a living. The Galactic News Network ran multiple segments. Public opinion turned against Zendax hard. 6 months after it started, Zendax quietly dropped all their claims. The station was too much trouble. Too well defended. And the PR nightmare of looking like corporate bullies wasn't worth whatever minerals they might eventually extract. Webb's reach was here to stay. Frank celebrated by buying a round of drinks at Betty's restaurant for everyone on the station. They'd fought off one of the biggest corporations in known space. Not with fancy technology or superior firepower, but with community, determination, and really good paperwork. It was the most human victory imaginable. 5 years after buying what everyone called a worthless orbital station, Frank celebrated his 72nd birthday in the Garden Dome of Section H. The dome was one of his proudest achievements, a massive transparent structure filled with plants from a dozen different worlds. The hydroponic systems were ancient Ktharn technology that he'd spent 6 months restoring, and now they produced fresh vegetables and fruits for the entire station. Rachel had come from Earth with his grandchildren, Danny and Sophie. The kids were running through the rows of plants, their laughter echoing off the dome walls. Danny, who was 10, kept stopping to stare at the alien plants with their bizarre colors and strange shapes. Sophie, 8 years old, was more interested in the earth tomatoes growing next to purple Ktharn vegetation. "Grandpa, you built all this?" Danny asked, his eyes wide as he looked up at the massive dome structure overhead. "Fixed it," Frank corrected him, kneeling down to meet his grandson's eyes. "There's a big difference. Someone else built this thousands of years ago. I just figured out how to make it work again." "But how?" "It's so old." Frank smiled and tapped the nearest support beam. "Good engineering lasts forever, kiddo. You just have to respect what the original builders were trying to do." Webb's Reach now housed over 2,000 permanent residents. What had started as one crazy old man with a tool bag had become a thriving community. The fabrication system ran 3 shifts around the clock, producing parts for half the frontier colonies. Ships came from 6 sectors away specifically to do business at Frank's station. The place still wasn't fancy. Never would be. Other stations had gleaming corridors and holographic displays and artificial intelligence running everything. Webb's Reach had hand-painted signs, exposed wiring, and systems you could actually fix with a wrench and some common sense. But that was exactly why people came here. When something broke at Webb's Reach, it got fixed within hours, not replaced with expensive new equipment after weeks of waiting for parts. Frank had started teaching classes 3 years ago. People called it the Webb Technical Institute, which Frank thought was way too fancy a name. He just called it shop class. He showed people how to work with old systems, how to listen to what machines were trying to tell you, how to fix things instead of throwing them away and buying new ones. His students came from all over. Humans, obviously, but also members of species that had forgotten how to repair their own technology. They'd become so dependent on buying new things that the basic skills had disappeared. His most promising student was a young Ktharn woman named Sarah, though Frank just called her Tess. She'd grown up with replicator technology and quantum computers. Everything in her life had been cutting-edge, state-of-the-art, impossible to understand unless you had 3 advanced degrees. The analog systems on Webb's Reach frustrated her at first. Frank would watch her staring at a simple mechanical valve, trying to figure out why it worked better than the sophisticated alternatives she'd grown up with. "Why not just upgrade this?" she asked one day, standing in the workshop while Frank repaired a pressure regulator using parts that were literally older than human civilization. "Why not install modern systems?" Frank held up the ancient valve he was cleaning. "Because this works. It's worked for 4,000 years and it'll work for 4,000 more. Fancy isn't always better, Tess. Sometimes simple, durable, and fixable beats advanced and fragile." Tess wasn't entirely convinced, but she kept showing up to class. She kept learning. Frank figured that was enough. Later that evening, Rachel found him in his quarters, standing at the viewport and watching ships come and go. The station traffic had gotten busy. A freighter was docking at Bay 3. A passenger shuttle was departing from Bay 7. The fabrication bay was lit up bright, working on a large order. Lights glowed in windows throughout the station. It was alive in a way Frank had only dreamed about 5 years ago. "Any regrets, Dad?" Rachel asked quietly, coming to stand beside him. Frank thought about it. Really thought about it. His retirement savings were completely gone. He worked longer hours now than when he'd been officially employed. His back hurt every morning. His hands were covered in scars and calluses. He was pretty sure he'd die on this station, probably while fixing something that everyone else said couldn't be fixed. "Nope," he said finally. "Not one single regret. You could have been relaxing on Earth. Traveling. Enjoying your retirement like a normal person." Frank laughed. "This is more me than relaxing ever was. I'm doing what I love. I'm useful. I'm teaching people skills they need. And I proved something important." "What's that?" "That obsolete is just another word for misunderstood." A proximity alert chimed on his datapad. Another ship requesting docking clearance. Captain Willis from the outer mining colonies, probably needing parts for his hauler's aging drive system. Frank had those parts in stock. He'd fabricated them last week. "I should go," Frank said. "Work to do." Rachel hugged him. "I'm proud of you, Dad. You know that, right?" "I know." Frank headed down to the workshop, his steps sure despite his age. Behind him, through the viewport, Webb's Reach gleamed with lights against the darkness of space. An ancient station that everyone had written off as worthless, brought back to life by one stubborn human who refused to accept that something was beyond fixing. 50 ships were docked at the station. 2,000 people called it home. The fabrication bay was producing parts that kept hundreds of vessels running. And somewhere in a classroom, students were learning that the old ways weren't always worse than the new ways. Frank Webb had spent 12,000 credits and 5 years of his life on a station everyone said was garbage. Best investment he'd ever made. And business was very, very good.